Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Today, and yesterday, and the day before, I made jerky. So today I want to show you the process of making this beef jerky, go over some safety rules about dehydrating meat, and because I didn't have my vacuum sealer ready, in the next video, I'll go into ways to store jerky. For this batch of jerky, storage is not going to be an issue. It's not going to last that long. Before we start, if you will, give us a thumbs up. And please subscribe and hit the notification bell at the top right. Now let's get started. So in my freezer, I had this little rump roast. It's a little bit over 2 pounds. Now, rump roast is not usually my choice for jerky because it has a fair amount of marbleization and a pretty healthy layer of fat. Too much fat in the meat can cause it not to preserve properly and can make it become rancid. So a round roast is probably a better choice, but we've got a rump roast here. Now what I'm showing you is the way the grain runs. That is across the grain. Long ways is with the grain. And we've got a little bit of the silver skin here, and I'm going to cut this off. And as you're watching this, please do not give me a note telling me my knife is not sharp. My knife is very sharp. My hands are not very sharp. Arthritis that gets worse regularly, so instead of pulling this off because I can't, I'm just gonna skim along and cut off the silver skin. When you see that on a roast or a piece of meat, usually you can grab it and pull it off, but it's okay to cut it. And I'm gonna have some little scraps here of the silver skin and perhaps a little bit of the beef. And I'm going to save those in my freezer in a little container. And when there's enough of it, I'll throw it all in with some beef broth with some bones so it's not going to be wasted. And as I trim this up and get it ready to cut for jerky, I'm going to take the opportunity to dispel some jerky myths. Yes, there are jerky myths out there. And I'm going to do a summary of jerky myths at the end of this video. One myth is that making jerky out of meat is a way to make it safe for long-term storage. That's just not the case. And I guess that depends a lot on what you consider long-term storage. USDA says 2 weeks in a bag or a jar. Other sources say 1 to 2 months if you vacuum seal it with oxygen absorbers. But generally speaking, if you want to keep it longer than 2 weeks, you want to refrigerate it or freeze it. And I know there are folks that make jerky and vacuum seal it and put it on a shelf and expect it to be there for the apocalypse. But I often say it would be a shame to survive the apocalypse and die of food poisoning. So if you can't put it on a shelf forever, what's the purpose in making jerky? Well, if you're going on a camping trip, it's great to have some jerky to put in your backpack because it is going to be good for a couple of weeks. It's great to stick in a kid's lunchbox or your own lunchbox. I like to keep healthy low-carb snacks for my pocket or in my purse. So making jerky does mean you can have some convenience food that's healthy and homemade ready. It does extend its shelf life, but it doesn't extend it for a long time. If you'll see, there's some fat I've left here that I'm going to get once I start slicing. Now I've got this prepared to cut. But before I cut it, I'm going to put it in a little bag and loosely wrap it and stick it in the freezer for an hour to an hour and a half. It just makes it easier to slice. I'm going to stick this in the freezer and then I'll be back. Now, in case you don't know, inevitably someone will feel compelled to tell me that I'm full of malarkey. And on this period of safe storage for jerky, I refer you to this book. It's called So Easy to Preserve. It's a book I use for canning and freezing and dehydrating. It's a publication of the University of Georgia's National Center for Home Food Preservation, and if you are concerned with food safety, you need this book. And I will put some information about ordering it in the info section. I think it's out of stock right now, but it will be back in before you know it. So while the meat is in the freezer, let's make a marinade. And you can put a lot of different ingredients in a marinade. I started with a basic recipe in the So Easy to Preserve book. I will also put that recipe and my changes in the info section. Marinades can include oil, salt, spices, and acid ingredients such as vinegar, lemon juice, teriyaki, or soy sauce or wine. This one is a 1/4 cup soy sauce, a tablespoon of Worcestershire, 1/4 teaspoon each of pepper and garlic powder, except I left out the pepper, a 1/2 teaspoon of onion powder, a teaspoon of liquid smoke. I'm adding some onion powder and some paprika, and as I'm doing this, I realize my garlic powder has solidified. So I'm just going to break off some little pieces that are about a 1/4 teaspoonful worth, and it'll dissolve in the soy sauce. Now the soy sauce in this case is your acid. You don't have to have an acid, but an acid helps prepare the meat for drying. One of my favorite marinades for poultry, turkey or chicken, is Italian dressing, just bottled Italian dressing. Yeah, see, that's my solidified garlic powder. I need to order some. And you did hear me right. There can be oil in your marinade, even though you want to avoid fat in your jerky. But the process that we're going to go through removes that oil, and I'll show you that as we get to it. So I'm mixing this up. When I get it all mixed up, I'll be right back. So I got it all together, and I should mention that a lot of folks add a tablespoonful or 2 of brown sugar, and that's fine. I don't add sugar to anything. I have made it with monk fruit or sucrin, and it works just great, and it tastes just great. So here is my little roast. It's been in the freezer maybe an hour. It could have been a little longer, but I think I'm going to be fine with this. Now there are several different ways you can slice this. As I said, I'm going to slice this across the grain, and I've got that little fat layer to cut out. If you have a meat slicer, that's great. You want to keep this at about a 1/4 inch. I don't have a meat slicer. I have this little Pampered Chef doohickey here, and I have measured the tines of this, and they are about 1/8 of an inch apart. So in order to slice about a 1/4 inch, I'm going to cut between every other tine. And I want to get the one on the end just right at the outside of the meat. And you may be able to freehand 1/4 inch. I cannot. And even using this little tool, I may have a variation from a 1/4 inch. And I'll show you how we fix that. So I'm going to cut this here, get that fat layer off. And I'll show you how I'm going to do that in a minute. But that gives me a clean starting edge, and no, I'm not throwing away that piece of beef. So I'm going to cut down through every other tine, and this is going to give me about a 1/4 inch slice. And if I have some little edges, because this is not perfect, if I have some little edges, I'm going to beat them down with a rolling pin to get them to a 1/4 inch. Much like you would if you were making schnitzel. Now, to be clear, I have seen people slice the meat for jerky as thin as 1/8 of an inch. And what you get is a crunch, almost like a potato chip. To me, jerky is supposed to be hard on the outside, crunchy on the outside, but tender on the inside. But to be clear, you can cut it even thinner if you like. You just don't want to be much over a 1/4 of an inch, and that's for drying time and for long-term safety. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to mention a tool many of you have in your kitchen that you would find very helpful in this process. If you are a canner, you very likely have one of those debubbling wands that has little measurements on the end to measure 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch headspace in your canning jars. And that's a perfect little tool for measuring to make sure your meat is about 1/4 of an inch. Of course, I couldn't find mine today, and I'll find it as soon as I'm finished with this project. But in the meantime, I have this other little tool. So I'm going to finish slicing this up, and then I will be back. So now I'm going to deal with this little piece that's got the fat in it, and I'm just going to cut the fat off. And I've got some pieces left here that are well over 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to get my rolling pin out, and then we'll beat those down and get them to an acceptable thickness for dehydrating. I'm going to cut that off. Now the reason I'm cutting in here, meat is naturally fat. Any meat you get is going to have some fat in it, and you can never get rid of all of it, but you want to get rid of as much of it as you can, because the meat, as I mentioned earlier, fat that's in the meat when you store the meat can go rancid and shorten your safe storage time, and it will also detract from the good flavor of the meat. So while you can never get rid of every single absolute bit of fat, you can get rid of almost all the fat. And we will take more than one step to do that. So if you can see here, I've got some meat that has thick places in it. And I'm just going to beat it out, and I will go through and eyeball the rest of the meat. See, I'm thinning it out. I'll go through and eyeball it all in case I have an edge that's a little bit thicker than the rest. I want to try to get the thickness as consistent as possible. So when I get all this done, I will be back. So I'll just give you a glimpse here of how I've shortened that out, or how I've thinned that out. And these other little pieces, even though they're much smaller, I'm gonna thin those out too. And if you prefer a thinner, crispier jerky when you're finished, you can take these slices of beef and cut them into 2 or 3 strips so that you've got long, skinny kind of pieces. That's just your personal preference. I'm going with them in slices. Okay, so now we're going to add the marinade, and I will mention to you, yeah, that's 2 pieces. I didn't think it was that thick. That the marinade recipe I gave you is for 1.5 to 2 pounds of beef. Even with trimming, I've got right on the edge of 2 pounds of beef, maybe just a little bit more. So if I don't have quite enough marinade, I will add some soy sauce. So here is a jerky myth. You do not have to marinate meat in order to make it jerky. But if you do marinate it, you cut your dehydrating time way down. Marinated meat will dry out faster, mostly because of the acid that you have in here. And I don't think I've got quite enough marinade here. So I'm going to add a little more soy sauce. I'll turn this and try to get each piece covered. Get a coating on each piece. That's a lot of meat there. And this marinade mixture that I've made is just one. You can find dozens and dozens of different recipes for marinade for jerky on the internet. And if you were canning, I would tell you not to take advice from the internet. But the marinade in this is just for flavor, and it will, as I said, with a little acid, help it dehydrate a little faster. So feel free, make up the marinade that you think will taste good for you. A lot of people like it, like a little more pepper in it so that it's hotter and spicier. So now I'm going to cover this and put it in the fridge. 2 or 3 hours is enough, but it's getting late. I'm going to let this marinate overnight. So I'm going to cover this with one of my handy dandy shower caps. Best kitchen tool ever. I'll be back tomorrow. So it's tomorrow, and time for another jerky myth. Dehydrating is not a substitute for cooking. At some point in the process of making jerky, you need to make sure that the meat reaches 165 degrees. And it would be the rare dehydrator that you could be sure would get the meat to 165 degrees. So you can do it several ways. You can start with cooked meat, like leftover roast beef. I've even seen people make jerky out of sliced sandwich meat. Leftover Thanksgiving turkey or a rotisserie chicken. Or you can cook it at the end in your oven for at least 10 minutes at 250 degrees. Or you can do what I'm doing. I'm going to actually cook this meat in the marinade. And it's too small for me to measure with a thermometer the internal temperature of the food. But if you bring the marinade to a boil and you let the jerky simmer in that for at least 5 minutes, then you can be sure that the meat has reached an internal temperature of 165, and you've killed any pathogens that might be hiding in there, and you'll have safe jerky. Shelf stable for about 2 weeks or so. So I'm not going to show you this whole process because I'm going to do it in layers to make sure that all the meat gets hot all the way through. I'll turn it several times and then I will drain it on a paper towel and I'll be back. So it's been about 7 minutes and I'm taking up the first batch, and you can see I've got the temperature of this marinade up pretty darn high. It's sizzling. You don't see a single bit of pink left in this meat. And I'm going to put it over here on my paper towel and I'll blot it dry while the next batch is cooking. So here we are at the dehydrator, and if you saw my earlier video, I tested this dehydrator to make sure that its temperature, that the temperature you set it at is the temperature it actually reaches. This dehydrator goes up to 158 degrees. So you want to make your jerky between 145 and 165, and I'm going to suggest the higher of that, the better. I did preheat the dehydrator per directions. I'm not sure what good that does because it's open while I do all this, but I did preheat it. You want to place your jerky on your trays as close as you like, but not touching and not overlapping at all, because we want to have good airflow circulation. Now I'm going to suggest that if you have one of those dehydrators that does not have a circulating fan, you're going to have to increase your time a lot. This one has a fan in the bottom, and it blows the air up through, and then of course back down as the circulation happens. But it has 5 trays, and this is my first time to use it, so I'm pretty sure I can get all of this 2 pounds of meat on the 5 trays. I have set my timer for 3 hours. Most of the directions say to check it after 3 hours. And I'll tell you now that 3 hours was not nearly enough. This took 6 hours to get to the point where it was fully done all the way through. And then I'll show you how to check it. So I'll check back in with you after 3 hours. So it's been almost 3 hours. Not quite. But I'm going to go ahead and check it. And I took my thermometer out because I monitor it all along to make sure we're maintaining it to 45 and 165, and we are. Now I'm checking this. When this is done, the skin will crack, but the jerky will not break. The inside will still be tender and chewy. The outside will be crunchy depending on how you marinated it and how it was cooked beforehand. I'm doing this. I'm going to go ahead and roll trays because it's not nearly done. You see, it's kind of there. We don't want that. I'm going to rotate the trays and put the top one on the bottom and the bottom one on the top, just to make sure everything's getting heated uniformly. And I'll remind you here of what I said earlier. You could make jerky out of, say, a roast beef or a roast turkey that had been fully cooked before. If you did it by that method, this would be very different results at this point. It would probably be done, and it would probably crack open when you bent it like that. It would be much, much crispier. So if your ultimate goal in making jerky is a really crunchy piece of jerky, and some people prefer it that way, then you want to start with fully cooked meat. So I set it for an hour and a half, and then again an hour and a half, and after 6 hours, when you bend it, it cracks but doesn't break, tender inside, perfect. So my friend Josh is here. He's helping me with chickens today, and you've probably seen him in my videos before, and he is my guinea pig. So, hi Josh.
Hi.
You want to try the jerky?
Of course.
Okay. Grab some. I see you've already been munching.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Oh, that's good. That's really good.
What's the texture like?
Chewy and tender.
Oh, good.
But at the same time.
That's what we want.
Mm-hmm.
Anna?
Sure.
Help yourself. You know, I'm always telling people good neighbors are like gold.
That is really good. Oh my god.
No, I didn't get you in your... A little closer. There you go.
I think Ethan wants some too.
Can he chew it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good.
Nope. You want me to have it?
No, he wants what you got. Okay, so this is a keeper?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, guys.
Oh, you're welcome.
And thank you for everything you do for me.
Oh, you're welcome. Little guy.
So this is not the best presentation ever, but as far as storage goes, this is not going to last long. Anna's going to take some home. Josh is going to take some home. I'm going to eat some, and probably the rest of it will be gone tomorrow. But so for now, I'm just putting it in a quart plastic bag. I'm pressing out some of the air. If I were going to be keeping this either 2 weeks on the shelf or in the fridge or in the freezer, I would vacuum seal it either in a jar or in a bag. But right now my kitchen is full of happy talk and neighbors and friends, and so I'm going to go over the jerky myths. Just a quick recap. Number 1, dehydrating does not replace cooking. You don't want to start with raw meat and end with meat only been dehydrated. You either start with pre-cooked meat, you cook it in the marinade, or you cook it in the oven afterwards. Dehydrating is really not a method for long-term shelf-stable storage. If you vacuum pack it and use oxygen absorbers, it'll last longer, but count on 2 weeks, and if you want it longer than that, either refrigerate it for up to a month or freeze it long term. Meat does not have to be marinated before it's dehydrated, but marinated meat dries more quickly, more uniformly, and yeah, it's tastier when you're done. My thanks again to Anna and Josh, and especially Ethan. And I thought I would end the video with Ethan because, you know, you could never go wrong with a cute baby. Next time we dehydrate, I'll show you how I do turkey and how to get a little bit different results with a little bit different method. And I hope you find it helpful. Thank you for joining us today on Debbie's Back Porch, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.